So, hello, good evening, or good time zone, everyone. Thank you so much to Sam for having me. I'm Vicky Brewster. I'm a PhD candidate at Swansea University. My research focus is hauntings in 21st century fiction. And I'm going to be talking today about embodiment and AI discrimination in The 10th Girl by Sarah Faring and The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. Going to front load this with a spoiler warning. These are both books that have a big twist reveal at the end, and that is spoiled basically throughout my talk, right from the very beginning. So if you haven't read these texts and spoilers bother you, you might want to go eat up these amazing books first and then come back for the recording on YouTube. So with that warning given, let's get into it. I'm going to open with a brief synopsis of both books for those who aren't familiar. So The 10th Girl on the left hand there was released in 2019. It follows Mavi, a school teacher at a prestigious and remote Patagonian finishing school called Vaccaro School, and Angel, an individual playing a virtual reality game set in the same school. Mavi is revealed to be an artificial intelligence, a non-player character or NPC at the school, which is haunted by players who earn points for haunting and frightening the school's NPCs. The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle on the right was published in 2018, so just a year beforehand. The narrative follows Aidan Bishop, who lives the same day in a series of different bodies as he is required by the shadowy plague doctor to solve the murder of 1930s socialite Evelyn Hardcastle. He is aided by Anna and competing against Daniel and his violent ally, the Footman. Aidan eventually discovers the day at Blackheath is a virtual reality simulation, which acts as a punishment and rehabilitation for convicts. If he solves the murder, he can leave the looping day and return to his real life. So although apparently quite different books in different genres and with different popular receptions, The 10th Girl and The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle have got much in common. Both works are almost entirely set within a virtual reality simulation. Both are set in unknown futuristic time, but reimagined simulated historical periods, 1970s Patagonia and 1930s England, respectively. In this respect, both works take place in an unknown time period haunted by the past and present, and present a possible future that haunts the reader. Both works feature time loops in which the characters experience the same day or series of days a vast number of times, meaning the characters are also haunted by other possible presents. In his formulation of hauntology, Derrida introduced hauntology as looping histories, quote, repetition and first time. This is perhaps the question of the event as question of the ghost. Each time it is the event itself. A first time is a last time, end quote. In this way, the text conform to the patterns of hauntology, looping histories, ghosts or revenants that remain throughout these loops, subtly changing histories that are used in both texts to present ideas of justice and deserving. Existence within a simulation as opposed to existence in a physical world also merits considering from a hauntological perspective. Goldberg and Moore, in their introduction to theoretical perspectives on human rights and literature, identify how, quote, lyrical meditations upon the repetitious nature of traumatic experience can help to make intelligible the ineffable nature of time as it is haunted by individual and historical violence and suffering, end quote, highlighting the importance of the hauntology of traumatic experience in a way that is particularly pertinent to these texts. Both feature time loops and characters that reset after highly traumatic experiences in order to experience the same period of time repeatedly without memory of previous loops. The characters are forever haunted by their possible past, presents, and futures. The times in which the novels are set are unstable as a result of being the conceptions of a specific period of time, imagined by a simulation creator who had their own prejudices and preoccupations with the worlds they created. This instability adds to the feel of the simulated world as inferior to the physical world, allowing removal from it to be perceived as a kind of justice and true humanity to be dependent on escaping the simulation. This talk will investigate this link between hauntings and indeed hauntology, humanity and justice more thoroughly in the context of these two texts. First, within the framework of hauntology, both its original conception as expressed by Jacques Derrida and its developing and contemporary context as it has been co-opted into Gothic theoretics. The concept of justice in each text will be examined, both in a formalized judicial context and using Alan Zaitchik's theories on deserving. Finally, analyzing the use of simulation and AI in these texts, this talk will demonstrate a blurring of the boundary between real people and unreal people, using theories on posthumanism to assess where the boundary exists, if it exists at all. Okay. So Jacques Derrida's original theory of hauntology has been somewhat twisted and adapted into the public consciousness. As Merlin Coverley puts it, quote, becoming a shorthand for the ways in which the past returns to haunt the present, end quote. In the original French, l'ontologie is a pun on the concept of haunting with ontology, that being the branch of metaphysics that deals with the nature of being. However, hauntology is far more paradoxical than this pun suggests, concerned not only with the standard haunting of the present by the past, but the present by its possible futures and by the possible presents that could have been. As Derrida writes, quote, haunting is historical, but it is not dated, end quote. All time haunts all time. This can be further extended in speculative fiction to our conceptions of the future being haunted by the present in which they are conceived, and the past that influences that conception. Coverley writes that Derrida, quote, illustrates the increasingly ghostly nature of our communications media and the way in which information technology has begun to disrupt our conception of space and time, end quote. The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle and the 10th Girl's simulated worlds provide a virtual reality, shortened to VR, technology that does not yet exist, but it is conceivable based on existing VR tech, an example of which you see on your screen now. They express worlds that could have been conceived of in the 20th century, for example, as portrayed in the worlds of the Matrix series, but which are far more present in the 21st century, where VR headsets are becoming common in the domestic sphere, and Google and other tech companies are working on realistic augmented reality technology such as Google Glass. These texts are thus set in both the future and the past. They conceive of a world where simulated realities are absolutely immersive, but those simulations are set in a past the reader can recognize. Nevertheless, both of these pasts are somewhat nebulous. In particular, Turton's setting is sometime in the 1930s. The invitation to a house party that features in the book's front matter, which you can see on the left here, provides a location and list of characters, but no date. Turton has frequently referenced that Seven Deaths is his Agatha Christie book, and so the imprecise location in time may be a reference to the ambiguous timing of many Christie novels, and certainly Christie adaptations, that occur at some point in the interwar period without a certain fixing in time, sometimes called the nebulous 1930s. By contrast, Ferrings-Vaccaro's school setting is very specific, beginning in March 1978 and ending in June 1978. However, the school's remoteness, a necessary part of the game design, and the mannered archaic roles and setting of the school destabilizes such careful dating of the text. Furthermore, the sections of the novel set in Angel's Present are without time. The chapter titles feature the number 2020, which you can see on the right here, which could be taken as a year, an alternate 2020 in which VR simulation games are far more advanced than they were in the real 2020. But we discover that 2020 is actually Angel's login number for the game. And so the 2020 chapter heading could actually refer to this, a theory supported by the number which follows 2020, which appears to be Angel's score in the game. Here you can see Angel has 200 points. Coverley writes, quote, certain futures have the ability to haunt us even before they have come to pass, end quote. And this is the case with Turton and Ferrings' worlds. Both present a questionably near future or alternate present in which simulation supersedes reality or the physical world, haunting the reader with this possible future that has yet to come to pass. A key figure in hauntology is the revenant, quote, that which returns each time as if it were the first, unchanging and insistent, demanding a reckoning for a message that went unheard or was ignored, end quote. In the footnotes to Derrida's Spectres of Marx, the revenant, quote, figures both a dead man who comes back and a ghost whose expected return repeats itself again and again, end quote. The 10th Girl is full of revenants. Mavi and the other NPCs are figures who return at the start of each game loop, experiencing the world and setting as if it were the first time. Some of the idiosyncrasies that the NPCs exhibit towards the end of the loop, such as Teacher Mole's memorization and repetition of players' passwords, suggest some subconscious memory of previous game loops, but this is never confirmed. Charon, who is the avatar of the game master and co-designer, could be said to be a revenant, playing the same role over and over again, even though they exist and have a physical body outside of the game loop. Charon refers to how repetitive their role has become when they express surprise at some of the more original content Angel has accessed on their playthrough. Quote, "You're planning the sacrifice, for fuck's sake. The sacrifice ritual. Haven't heard of one of those happening in about 3 years," end quote. Finally, Angel has some aspects of the Revenants to their character. Although they are experiencing the game for the first time, characters and story aspects of the game are based on their childhood and the stories their mother, who co-designed the game, told them. They are also haunted throughout the novel by the grief of their brother's death and their role in that death, using the game Vaccaro School as a distraction, but also a constant reminder of their grief for both their mother and brother. In playing the game, Angel's relationship with Mavi constantly prompts what Coverley describes as a, quote, haunting of the present from the future, through the unfulfilled promise of that which never came to pass, end quote. Another prominent revenant is the eponymous 10th girl. The lore of the novel has it that Vaccaro School is built on the land of fictional indigenous tribe, the Zapuchi. As a side note, the Zapuchi don't actually exist in our reality, but they do exist in the real world of the book. When the colonizers first lived on the Zapuchi's lands, they were required to sacrifice a girl regularly to appease a curse that the tribe put on the land, known as the 10th girl. The 10th girl is also a figure in the Vaccaro School video game, an NPC controlled and played by the game's creators, who exists in Vaccaro School as separate from the other NPCs. She appears as a kind of ghost who provides exposition in the rare cases that players engage with the Zapuchi curse storyline. But she also has a life outside of the simulation. Angel remembers stories told by their mother about the 10th girl and the godlike powers she had due to her sacrifice. In many respects, the 10th girl is the only real ghost in the story, being the quote, the paradoxical figure who seemingly returns from the past into the present, and yet which properly belongs to neither. A figure whose return heralds not only a repetition of the past, but also an anticipation of the future, end quote. The 10th girl exists in the fictional past of Vaccaro School and haunts the present, but certainly belongs to neither time. Although she has a single avatar in Vaccaro School, she is a symbol of multiple sacrifices, all of whom have taken on the symbolic role of the 10th girl, and as such she acts as a repetition of the past and an anticipation of the future, of the sacrifices that will be needed and which Mavi almost makes herself. The figure of the Revenant is also key to the 7 Deaths of Evil in Hardcastle, in which Aidan is himself the Revenant of the novel. Aidan exists not once but 7 times within the day at Blackheath, occupying different host bodies as well as having a consciousness and physicality that exists in the future present beyond Blackheath. Aidan frequently meets himself within one of his other hosts, providing moments of self-haunting. Because Aidan lives the day reasonably consecutively, a full day in one host, resetting to the next when he goes to sleep or dies, with some exceptions, he also encounters both past and future versions of himself. The past versions haunt him, showing a day he has already lived and cannot change, despite the new things he has learned that might improve that day. For example, the arrival of one of his previous selves, quote, provokes the queerest of sensations. By any measure, this man is me, but I struggle to believe it, end quote. However, Aidan is more frequently haunted by the appearance of his future selves and the possibilities of violence they foreshadow. For much of the novel, Aidan knows that his final host will be Gregory Gold, who spends the majority of the book chained up and severely beaten in a gatehouse. Aidan knows this is his future. However, Gold has been beaten and restrained because he attacked the butler, another of Aidan's host. And so Aidan is haunted by the knowledge that he will perform this extreme feat of violence on himself. In one scene, Aidan is confronted by Gold before his beating, who appears, quote, in a frightful state, agitated and dishevelled, a man dragged to hell and back, end quote. Similarly, when Aidan encounters one of his future hosts for the first time, not realizing yet that he will occupy other hosts, he describes them as looking, quote, barely human, a remnant of some prior species lost in the folds of our evolution, end quote. Turton here situates these figures as barely human from Aidan's perspective, perhaps introducing an element of the uncanny, even when Aidan is unaware that the face is staring back at him or another version of himself. More than a theory about historical points in time, hauntology, as it draws on its roots in ontology, is concerned with the very nature of being. Coverley writes that, quote, being and haunting are interwoven concepts, the ghostly coming to invade every aspect of our lives. To be is to be haunted, end quote. Theories of posthumanism deal with issues of what we currently consider to be human and what falls outside, beyond, or after this idea of humanity. Anja Heijs van der Lip writes that posthuman Gothic texts, quote, highlight the instability and ultimate unsustainability of our most basic ontological category, the human, end quote. In Exits to the Posthuman Future, Arthur Croker describes posthuman as the, quote, radical undermining of all the previous markers of the human, end quote. While N. Catherine Hales writes that, quote, in the posthuman, there are no essential differences or absolute demarcations between bodily existence and computer simulation, end quote. This is particularly true in The 10th Girl and The Sudden Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, both of which create a distinct separation between the individual self and a physical body. In Fairing's work, many of the characters are entirely bodiless artificial intelligences, video game NPCs, who steal the bodies of the less deserving players towards the end of the novel. In Seven Deaths, Aidan has his own consciousness that is transferred to various host bodies, so he may experience the same day from multiple perspectives. While there is reference to his physical body in the real world, the reader never encounters it, and it remains more of an abstract concept. The reader learns to perceive Aidan as a personality divorced, or at least only loosely tethered to his physical body. The main characters of both texts are also able to travel between bodies. In Seven Deaths, the changing of bodies happens quite without any impetus from Aidan. However, in The 10th Girl, Mavi is taught by Angel how to push her digital consciousness from the confines of her body in order to possess another. This emphasis on possession recalls Hales's wording on disembodying in posthumanism. Quote, the liberal subject possessed a body, but was not usually represented as being a body, end quote. The preoccupation with embodiment of the self is a concern for Mavi when she realizes she is not a physical person, but a digital construction. Quote, if Angel is right, there is one rule to our existence, that there shall be no relief. And I need to prove or disprove it now. So I stab myself in the neck with a steak knife, end quote. For Croker, the posthuman is tied up with the body. He describes the emerging species mediations of posthumanism as, quote, technological beings who are part code, part skin, end quote. However, Mavi exists as a posthuman before she has a physical body. She proves her digital body to be distinctly inhuman when she cuts herself to test her humanity, a trope in itself explored in the film Ex Machina, which is what's pictured, and other texts that test the boundaries of physical humanity. They are analysed at some length by Anja Heijs van der Lip. That Mavi inhabits a physical body at the end of the book raises questions about her posthumanism. Is she posthuman at the moment of her sentience, at the moment she realizes what she is, namely a computer program, or at the moment at which she inhabits a physical body in the physical world? Does this move to physicality remove the post of her posthumanism to allow her to become purely human? The act of cutting herself to provide visual proof of her humanity follows Hales's assertion that, quote, observer and system are reflexively bound up with one another, end quote. Mavi is able to use her observations of the system, which is also herself, in order to theorize and prove her own posthumanism, or as she first perceives it, her non-existence. This then feeds into Mavi's conception of what makes a person. Quote, I am not a person at all by the traditional definition implanted in us. I am a pale imitation of a self, someone's toy, everyone's joke, end quote. As she comes to know herself and her world better, however, she develops this idea, quote, I have become capable of rewriting the rules of who a person can be, end quote. This conforms to Hales's statement, quote, as long as the human subject is envisioned as an autonomous self with unambiguous boundaries, the human-computer interface can only be passed as a division between the solidity of real life on one side and the illusion of virtual reality on the other, end quote. The phenomena that allows Mavi and, to some extent, her fellow NPCs to become post-human is what Croker terms drift culture, and particularly code drift. Quote, code drift theorizes the momentous evolutionary movement by which the previously separate regimes of biology and digitality unify in a world picture dominated by the universalization of the code form, end quote. Mavi is herself a flow of data, perhaps given more attention than the other NPCs as she is heavily based on one of the code's creators, but through chance variations, through unexpected uses and creative applications, she has gained a greater degree of sentience than her fellows. She has evolved and comes to believe that she has achieved a form of personhood that supersedes the human. The difference between virtual reality and physical reality is, however, clearly demarked in The 10th Girl. When Mavi is first pushed from what she perceives to be her body into the coding of the simulation, she describes the difference between the two. Quote, and I fall into a vibrant and separate universe of numerals painted like fish scales on the walls, translucent, gummy, end quote. The image of numerals, so reminiscent of the aesthetic of the Matrix films, which also portray real people escaping from a simulated world, also appears repeatedly after this moment. These can represent the literal characters that make up the coding of a video game or any computer simulation. They create a sense of unreality. Quote, plasticized numerals that glisten and glow as I move, adding a transparency to the world around me, end quote. Drawing a contrast between the world within the simulation, the world where the simulation is visible, and the real physical world which Mavi hopes to soon inhabit. This is recalled when Mavi achieves her physical body, and the first thing she finds is, quote, screens of jittering numerals so small they disappear, end quote. The world that is all Mavi has ever known is reduced to digits on a number of screens that are so small they disappear, relating her previous existence to the superiority of her new physical existence and finding no comparison. The traditional Gothic and the complexities of digital programming come together in Jodi Castricano's theory of cryptomimesis. The theory is, quote, predicated on encryption, the play of revelation and concealment lodged within parts of individual works, end quote, applicable to the revelation and concealment in both of these text-simulated worlds. Texts of simulation naturally involve encryption in terms of the coding used in order to create the simulated worlds. This is especially apparent in The 10th Girl from its cover, which you see pictured here, which features a crumbling old country house that at its peripheries is made up of characters that imply coding. They're quite small, but you can see them just kind of in the bottom left corner and the top right. The aesthetic is similar, as we've said, to that used in The Matrix, and therefore would be recognizable in the common parlance of popular culture. However, encryption is also apparent in the text of The 10th Girl in the form of Easter eggs included by the author. In computing, especially video games, an Easter egg is, quote, an unexpected or undocumented message or feature hidden in a piece of software intended as a joke or bonus, end quote. After the acknowledgements, Fairing has included a section entitled 7 Things You Might Have Missed in The 10th Girl, enumerating a number of clues Fairing included in the text to, quote, hint at Vaccaro School's true nature, end quote. This could suggest the author's intention to conflate further her fictional world with the world of a video game simulation. The metatext itself is like a game for the reader, providing encrypted clues or jokes to gamify the experience of reading. However, this destabilization of the reality of 1970s Argentina as presented in the Vaccaro School simulation could also be an example of a Latinx minority redressing a traumatic cultural past. Tock Thompson writes that, quote, the US is still haunted by its unresolved past of xenophobia and violence that continues into the present. Ghost stories thus present an alternative history of the oppressed, end quote. Angel's mother has created a ghost story that expresses her life, her history in pre-revolution Argentina, which she would not otherwise have been able to tell. This history is expressed in the form of a ghost story produced by a xenophobic American and bastardized to some extent by Charon, but still allowing her child Angel to connect with their history. Vaccaro School's NPCs are categorized as less than human by Charon and by the game's players. This is apparent in Charon's attitudes to violence against the NPCs. The violence perpetrated against them is perceived as justified, both because they are not physical humans but coding, and because they have the ability to reset and do not remember what is done to them during previous game loops. Similarly, neither the witnesses of Blackheath nor its convicts have memory of previous loops, and Daniel and Aidan at various times perpetrate violence without remorse. This supports Heiss-von-der-Lipp's theory that, quote, the fatal exploitation of bodies has nevertheless become a recurring motif in post-human Gothic text, end quote. Although there is again the sticky point of the body and whether personhood relies on physicality. What Charon and Vaccaro School's players perpetrate violence against is technically not a body, but the idea or code of a body. Mavi proves to herself that she heals wounds unnaturally, but there is frequent evidence that the NPCs still experience pain. They certainly experience terror. Cryptomimesis further deals with hauntings as inheritance. Castricano writes, quote, the topic of revenants and desire cannot be separated from that of ghostly inheritance, whether in the sense of what is received by descent or succession, or what returns in the form of a phantom to tax the living, end quote. There are several forms of inheritance in The 10th Girl, the most obvious of which is Angel's inheritance of the simulation game itself. Angel's mother co-created Vaccaro School as a means to insert her own history, and it is implied personality, into both the mythology of the school and the character and history of Mavi. However, there is also a haunting inheritance of colonialism. The curse which is said to haunt Vaccaro School is the revenge of the Sapuchi. This takes the form of ghosts known as Los Otros, exacting revenge on their colonizers through hauntings. Thompson notes the inevitable link between ghosts and vengeance when he writes, quote, ideas about proper or ethical behavior are frequently reflected in all ghost stories. Since the production of ghosts is linked to its opposite, ghosts display the shadow of ethics by haunting individuals and communities with past ethical failures, end quote. Castricano agrees that, quote, haunting implies not only debt, but also guilt, end quote. The characters resident at Vaccaro School spend most of the book assuming that their haunting is the result of earlier Vaccaros stealing and building on Sapuchi land, creating a colonial guilt that infuses the novel. While posthumanism is not explored as rigorously in The Seven Deaths of Evil in Hardcastle as in The 10th Girl, there are nevertheless concepts that suggest posthumanism is an important factor. Aidan exists as a physical individual, but his being or humanity is affected by and increasingly indiscriminate from the personalities of his hosts. The people Aidan inhabits and calls his hosts are described by the plague doctor as witnesses. They are people who were really present at the original murder of Evelyn Hardcastle in the 1930s, but their own consciousnesses have been hollowed away to allow Aidan to inhabit them. However, the longer Aidan spends in the simulation, the more the personalities of his hosts assert themselves over him. At times, he is able to utilize the personalities of his hosts, giving them free rein in order to take advantage of qualities they possess that Aidan does not. For example, Darby's violence, Ravencourt's analytics, Dance's logic, and so on. But he finds it increasingly difficult to separate his own feelings from theirs. As he comes towards the end of the book, Aidan describes how all of his hosts have taken up a residence in his consciousness. Quote, my chorus comes with me, Dance, Darby and Rashton out ahead, Bell, Collins and Ravencourt struggling behind. I know they're figments of my fracturing mind, but I can see them as clearly as reflections, end quote. The ghosts of all these dead men, these witnesses, find new life within Aidan. And while they don't appear to have a motivation of their own in the context of the simulation, it is implied they are reluctant to give Aidan up as a living host. It is as if they hope to latch onto him, to be carried on into the real world. The separation between Aidan's own personality, his I, and his several simulated bodies again conforms with a preoccupation in cryptomimesis, in which a separation is required between the I and the physical form in order for a phantom to occur. Aidan, however, feels the intrusion of other I's in the form of his host personalities and histories. These encroachments are their own phantoms, perhaps beyond those conceived of in cryptanalysis, and do not seem to be important to the solving of the Blackheath mystery. One may then wonder why they are present at all if they serve no purpose to the simulation and the justice it purports to serve. However, these additional phantoms do act to conflate Aidan's own idea of self, and with that conflation, make it more difficult to situate him as an individual. The purpose of developing Aidan's sense of individuality and changing idea of who he is as a person is central not only to posthumanism, but also to the judicial system of which Aidan is a part. Considering posthuman Gothic, Hysponderlip writes that the concept is particularly important for, quote, what this means for derivative concepts like human rights or the humanities, end quote. From human rights, it is an easy leap to justice and judicial systems, which in part exist to uphold human rights. Similarly, Curtis states that, quote, haunted fictions often seek to restore to attention something, such as injustice, that is absent from the record, end quote. In creating these haunted texts that deal with themes of justice, the authors of these texts promote an idea of justice that is based on deserving and on poetic justice, rather than the 21st century model of trial, conviction, and sentence with which the reader will be more familiar. Turton and Faring both use hauntings to bring to light injustices of a legal and moral nature, and provide a kind of rehabilitative sentence to provide closure on these injustices. Justice, then, is one of these derivative subjects so tied up with the Gothic posthuman. In particular, what justice means for human rights in a world where our concept of the human is altered or obliterated entirely. Both of these texts feature a central theme of justice, either explicitly or implicitly. In Seven Deaths, the repeated attempts to solve a mystery act as a method of redemption and rehabilitation in a penal colony. The Blackheath simulation is a literal tool of justice, featuring characters who are jailers in the figure of the plague doctors. The purpose of resolving the mystery of Evelyn Hardcastle's murder is to escape this penal system and return to a normal life. In The 10th Girl, justice is dealt with in a less structured format. The concept of deserving is central to the story, and this question of desert results in a decision on who deserves a physical body as opposed to a purely artificial existence within the game simulation. This justice is administered by partisan individuals, but is presented to the reader as justice nonetheless. In both cases, the reward offered by justice is the achievement of a physical body. In Seven Deaths, the physical body Aidan left behind to infiltrate Blackheath, and in The 10th Girl, the stolen physical body of a player. This emphasis on physicality as opposed to purely artificial existence within a digital simulation draws on theories of posthumanism. The 10th Girl invites the reader to consider the sentience of artificial intelligences in the form of the non-player characters in a game. These characters have developed sentience, personalities, and existences that go beyond their coding, yet are the victims of abuse and discrimination because they do not possess physical bodies and are considered, therefore, less than human. Distributive justice determines the socially just allocation of resources and has long been concerned with what Zaitchik describes as, quote, considerations of personal desert or merit, end quote. Many systems of justice, such as those in the UK, are based upon common laws that are sometimes perceived morally as unfair, but are arguably simple to implement and control. Distributive justice, by comparison, perhaps seems a fairer justice system as it relies on social justice and desert, but it is philosophically based and therefore problematic to consistently agree upon and apply. However, the justice presented in The 7 Deaths and in The 10th Girl follow a largely distributive system of justice. Turton presents a futuristic world in which distributive justice has apparently been systematically implemented, although this presents its own ethical issues, which we'll get to in a minute. Faring, meanwhile, presents a more ad hoc justice of the people, as the lexical choices of the narrative increasingly reference deserving and deserts, leading to the distribution of physical embodiment as a kind of justice. In Desert and Virtue, a theory of intrinsic value, Stephen Kirshner writes that, quote, desert is a part of the good, not the right, end quote, suggesting that it is a part of what makes the world a better place rather than describing how one should act. And it is this that forms the basis of Faring's conception of justice. Justice in The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle takes a formal role in the story. The plague doctor tells Aidan that there are many mysteries like the one at Blackheath, which many prisoners are attempting to solve both as a penance and a form of rehabilitation. In Cryptomesis, Castricano writes, quote, "How did the dead recover a debt? How did the living acquit themselves?" End quote. Although the dead are not strictly the party demanding repayment of a debt in Seven Deaths, the living are nevertheless required to acquit themselves. This is not done through the formal trial mechanism contemporary readers might expect, but through completion of a trial in the form of a puzzle or mystery. Removing justice from the courtroom in the Seven Deaths of Evil in Hardcastle in some ways makes the justice more poetic, with the penance and rehabilitation fitting the crime, but in other ways the sentence is more barbaric. In Inhuman Conditions, Feng Chia refers to human rights as, quote, "a violent gift," end quote, highlighting the conflation between alleged justice and violence and the importance of suffering in the judicial system, both recognizing the suffering of others and perhaps the suffering of the guilty party. This is a conflation that is ever present in the Seven Deaths. The puzzle which needs to be solved in order for justice to be served is the murder of a young woman, and having been placed in opposition to convicts with few morals, the solving of that murder involves a number of violent episodes. Talking about the violence in the novel, Stuart Turton says, quote, "I wanted to make sure the violence was horrific, not just because it builds threat and tension, but because it should be terrifying," end quote. Violence between characters provides most of the horror elements in the book. Besides Aidan's attack as Gregory Gold on himself as the butler, the majority of the violence comes in the form of the footman, who stalks Aidan on Daniel's behalf throughout the story, viciously murdering some of his hosts. Aidan is very afraid of violence and the possibility of pain. The knowledge then of future potentially unavoidable violence haunts him for much of the book. It is telling that it is not until Aidan has solved the murder that he has changed the day sufficiently to avoid his own beatings, once more linking the violence of the story to the justice and rehabilitation mechanism, the simulation itself. It is worth acknowledging that the world of Blackheath is essentially a torture chamber. Daniel and Anna are never intended to solve Blackheath's mystery and leave, and the possibility that Anna might do so provokes the interference of the plague doctor prison guardians. Furthermore, Aidan is first allowed to enter Blackheath in order to exact revenge against Anna for her murder of his sister. This violent revenge is apparently sanctioned by Blackheath's guardians, even though Aidan dooms himself to the same torture of existence within Blackheath. The confines and practices of Blackheath are never referred to as torturous or unethical, but as justice and rehabilitation, even when the individual undergoing justice can no longer remember their crime. The reader is furthermore never privy to the justice system that convicted Anna and Daniel, and has only a single, arguably unreliable report of Anna's crimes from the plague doctor. Aidan is informed by the plague doctor that he has already experienced this day at Blackheath many thousands of times, enough to have served a penal sentence decades long. This prolonged repetition means that Aidan has lost much sense of who he is. The plague doctor says, quote, "I've seen so many versions of Aidan Bishop, you'd probably never recognize yourself in them," end quote. This loss of self is also spectral. Assuming Aidan entered whatever facility runs the simulations as a physical being, his non-physical being has been through so much it is materially changed from its original form. Does this mean that Aidan's original self is now a ghost? Or is the Aidan we encounter in the story a ghost, a consciousness separate and distinct from his physical body and original personality? While justice is not formally raised in The 10th Girl as it is in The Seven Deaths of Evil in Hardcastle, the text nevertheless presents a narrative in which its characters undergo trials based on ethical values, and a judgment and sentence are made at the end, based on which characters are deemed worthy of a physical body. In particular, the narrative concerns itself with Mavi and whether she has become sufficiently human or post-human to earn a body, even if she must steal it from an unsuspecting player. Similarly, the story seems to question whether Angel deserves the body they already have, as they are nearly left bodiless at the end of the novel. The word deserve appears 23 times in The 10th Girl, underscoring the concept's importance to Fairing. The concept of desert is used frequently in a passage dealing with whether Mavi deserves to know the truth as Angel can provide it. Quote, "I still haven't told you the whole truth, and you deserve that. You understand? I've been a demon. I don't deserve you. I don't deserve any of this. as if I can begin to say which cruelties anyone does or does not deserve, end quote. This presents truth as a kind of justice, it being something that a character can deserve or not. In this instance, the truth that Mavi deserves is that she is an AI encased in a simulation and that she does not have a physical body. There is also the question here of who deserves whom. When Angel says, I don't deserve you, they are presenting Mavi as a kind of reward, an object or prize that can be deserved in the same way it could be won. This relegates Mavi once again to a position as object rather than person. Angel then, however, questions whether they are a fit individual to make decisions about others deserving, and specifically who deserves cruelty, which in a judicial context could also mean punishment. This raises questions about what qualifies an individual to pass judgment on desert. Charon also frequently refers to deserving, although in a less strictly judicial way than Angel. When referring to Angel discovering specific hard-to-find aspects of law in the Vaccaro School game, Charon says, quote, plus 2,000 experience points to Gryffindor. Good for you. You deserve it, end quote. Here, Charon is speaking somewhat sarcastically, praising Angel for uncovering truths about Vaccaro School, while insinuating they won't get them very far. In this sense, when Charon says you deserve it, they mean both the information that Angel has acquired and its lack of usefulness. It is worth remembering that Charon is a figure of colonial power and post-colonial negligence in the novel, given the context under which they hired Angel's mother as a Latin flavor developer on the Vaccaro School game. Goldberg and Moore note that we must, quote, recognize human justice's imperialist origins and complicities with global power and corruption, end quote, when considering human rights and justice in general. The standardized justice system is one which favors the colonizer, and as such, Charon might be perceived as a figure of traditional justice in the game. They are a white American in an aspirational job, living what some might term the American dream. They are the ultimate arbiter over what happens in the game as a person who is responsible for the game's code. In many respects, Charon is the justice of the Vaccaro School, and that justice is prejudiced against colonized minorities. The 10th Girl also presents the haunting of Vaccaro colonizers by the Sapuchi curse as a kind of justice, conflating ideas of justice and revenge. However, resort to curses might be the only kind of justice an Indigenous people can expect. As Goldberg and Moore note, referencing Hannah Arendt, quote, one of the central paradoxes of human rights is that they are available foremost to citizens, such that statelessness or marginalization within state formations challenges individual and collective claims to rights, end quote. This highlights that the marginalized, be that Indigenous peoples or artificial intelligences not yet considered human, are excluded from a formal course of justice. They may therefore advocate their own justice system, in this case based on either revenge or desert. Comparing the two, desert seems the far more favorable mechanism of judicial decision-making. The concept of reward through receiving physical embodiment is proposed explicitly by Mavi in her narrative. Quote, we can edit ourselves and perhaps even come into possession of the flesh we deserve, end quote. This suggests that the trials Mavi and the other NPCs endure at the hands of the players is a kind of trial by fire, in which by decades worth of loops of enduring, the NPCs have served some kind of sentence and earned the right to physical bodies. This will require the removal of physical bodies from the players who are guilty of torturing and subjugating AIs, treating them in their game world as subhuman. This crime has the sentence of making they themselves digital entities in place of the game NPCs. This is alluded to when Mavi uses the phrase edit ourselves. While Mavi can't know about the terminology, editing is a phrase frequently used in coding and game design, where editing means to change the way a game runs. Mavi is proposing editing her own game, and as a result, her life, to give herself a physical body. To conclude, the simulated worlds in the text discussed exist to serve a purpose, that being to provide a form of justice. However, this assumes a perspective external to the simulation, which we don't really get in either novel. Both are focused on the digital inhabitants of the simulated worlds, and their experiences of simulation are the sum total of their remembered experience. They're given the promise of a physical world beyond the simulation, and in particular a body, but the reader encounters very little of that body beyond the promise that it represents a higher form of existence. The implication is that the digital virtual world is inferior to physical reality, despite the simulation being the setting of both stories, the location of the action. There is therefore a tension here, a disagreement between the location most interesting for the story taking place and the ideal place any individual wants to be. Either way, the body is presented as the ultimate goal, partly because it offers a release from the endless time loops of the virtual world. It offers a location in which time once again becomes linear, and the various hauntings of past, present, and future will finally end. Thank you very much. I've got a couple of pages of works cited that I will go through slowly in case anyone wants to screen grab them. There we go.